The real reason you're not wealthy yet has nothing to do with what you've been told to fix. Not your income, not the economy, not the opportunities you missed or the ones that never quite arrived. Not discipline, not effort, not the absence of the right connections at the right moment. Something else entirely. Something that has been operating inside you, silently, automatically, without your awareness, since long before you had any opinion about money or any understanding of what wealth even meant. And what makes this difficult to accept isn't that it's complicated. It's that it has been running so long, reinforced so consistently, that it stopped feeling like something installed and started feeling like something true. Like an accurate description of how things work. Like just the way your life is. You felt the evidence without knowing what to call it. The money that arrives and disappears before you understand the direction it traveled. The moment something real became possible and something beneath the surface pulled back before you could fully reach. The financial life that keeps surfacing in unguarded moments. Vivid, specific, stubbornly present, while the one you're actually living moves in a completely different direction. That distance isn't circumstance. It isn't character. It's architecture. And by the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly what that architecture is made of and why it was always possible to change it. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success. So I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. There's a word most people associate with financial failure that Napoleon Hill almost never used. Laziness. Not because lazy people don't exist, but because in 20 years of studying people who struggled financially, people who worked hard, tried repeatedly, wanted more with genuine sincerity, laziness almost never appeared as the actual cause. What appeared, consistently and across wildly different circumstances, was something far less visible and far more consequential. A mismatch. Not between effort and outcome, though that mismatch was real. Between the financial life a person was consciously pursuing and the financial identity their deeper mind had already decided was appropriate for someone like them. The effort was real, the filter was invisible, and the filter was winning. Every decision you make about money, every opportunity you reach for or pull back from, every risk that feels proportionate or excessive, every moment where expansion becomes possible and something in you either moves toward it or contracts, all of it passes through that filter before it reaches conscious awareness. You don't experience the filter as a filter. You experience it as judgment. As your own honest, reasonable assessment of what's realistic for someone in your position. But it isn't judgment. It's programming. And that difference matters enormously, because judgment updates with new information, while programming requires something different entirely to change. Hill observed that the most financially limiting beliefs were almost never the ones people could articulate. Those were visible enough to be confronted. The dangerous ones had sunk so deep into the operating layer of the mind that they no longer registered as beliefs at all. They registered as facts. Facts about how money moves, about who it flows toward and who it consistently avoids, about what separates the people who build wealth from the people who spend their lives in its proximity without ever quite arriving. And here's what makes those facts so resistant to change. They were formed before you had any ability to evaluate them. When the mind was in its most receptive state, absorbing everything, questioning nothing, converting repeated experience into standing instructions about how the world operates. Most of those instructions served you. Some of them were wrong, not maliciously, formed in good faith, from real experience, by people who believed what they were passing down. But wrong in the way a map drawn for one territory is wrong when you try to navigate another with it. The territory changed. The map didn't. And you've been trying to reach a destination that the map in your hand has never included. But this goes deeper than thinking patterns or conscious beliefs. Because what Hill identified wasn't just about how people thought about money. It was about how they felt in its presence. And that distinction, between thinking and feeling, is where everything actually lives. Most people, when they imagine having real wealth, experience something they don't immediately recognize as a problem. The image forms, the number appears, the life takes shape, the freedom, the options, the particular quality of daily existence that comes with genuine financial security. And then, almost immediately, something else arrives. Not excitement, not the clean, forward-pulling energy of desire moving toward its object. Something more complicated. A subtle but persistent sense that the image doesn't quite fit, that it's slightly too large for the space you currently occupy, that the version of you standing inside that picture doesn't feel entirely like you. Most people experience this and conclude the vision is too big, that they need to adjust expectations towards something more realistic. They have it exactly backwards. What they're feeling isn't the vision correcting itself. It's the existing financial identity defending its boundary. The deep, subconscious model of who you are in relation to money encountering an image that exceeds its current definition of appropriate, and generating the precise discomfort that signals a limit is being approached. Hill understood this with unusual clarity. He observed that the emotional response to imagined wealth was one of the most reliable indicators of a person's actual financial programming. Not their conscious attitude, not the beliefs they could articulate if asked, but the felt, immediate, pre-verbal response that arose before the thinking mind had time to construct a story around it. That response tells you something the thinking mind consistently obscures. It tells you exactly where the subconscious has drawn the line. Think about the difference between imagining a financial outcome slightly better than your current situation and imagining one that's genuinely transformative. The first produces something like comfortable hope, movement towards something recognizable, within the range your identity considers plausible. The second produces something harder to name, a mixture of longing and unreality that most people find quietly destabilizing. That destabilization is precise information. It marks the exact location of the ceiling, not the ceiling imposed by circumstance, the one maintained by identity, the one that exists not in the world but in the gap between what the conscious mind is reaching for and what the subconscious has accepted as the appropriate size for someone like you. Hill called this poverty consciousness, not as a moral judgment, but as a technical observation about the orientation of a mind that has absorbed, at the deepest level, the belief that scarcity is its natural condition. And here's the counterintuitive part. It doesn't feel like a belief about scarcity. It feels like realism, like the grounded, responsible assessment of someone who has learned how things actually work. From the inside, it feels like wisdom, when what it actually is a ceiling disguised as discernment. The person operating from poverty consciousness doesn't experience themselves as someone who believes wealth is unavailable to them. They experience themselves as someone being honest about what's realistic. Someone who has moved past naive optimism into a clearer understanding of financial life. That sense of clarity is the most expensive thing they carry, because it isn't clarity about the world. It's clarity about a story, written under conditions that no longer exist, by a version of them with far less information than they have now. Dismantling that story requires understanding something almost nobody explains correctly. The thing almost nobody explains correctly is this. You cannot think your way out of a feeling-level belief. Not through logic. Not through intellectual recognition that the story is wrong. Not through accumulating evidence that contradicts it, however compelling. The part of the mind where financial identity actually lives doesn't respond to argument. It doesn't update because you've made a convincing case to yourself. It updates through experience. Most people, when they discover their financial ceiling is a product of belief rather than circumstance, immediately try to change the belief through thinking. They examine it, challenge it, replace the negative statement with a positive one, repeat the positive one until it feels more familiar. They find the logical errors in the original belief and construct rational arguments against it. None of it reaches deep enough. Because the belief wasn't installed through logic. It was installed through the accumulated emotional weight of repeated experience, absorbed before the mind had any capacity to evaluate what it was taking in. And what's installed through experience can only be reliably replaced through experience, not necessarily external experience. That's the part that changes everything. Hill understood something about the subconscious that most people, even those familiar with his work, never fully absorb. The deeper mind doesn't make a reliable distinction between what is vividly imagined and what is physically lived, not as a metaphor, as a functional description of how that layer of the mind actually processes input. A fear built through repeated real exposure and a fear built through repeated vivid imagination produce nearly identical responses in the deeper mind. The emotional weight of a memory of something that happened and the emotional weight of something intensely imagined are, at the level where financial behavior originates, processed through the same mechanism, which means the subconscious can be given new experience without the external world having to change first. Hill called this autosuggestion, and it is consistently the most misunderstood principle in his entire body of work. Most people hear it and think affirmations, positive statements repeated without conviction into a space that doesn't seem to be listening. That's not what he meant. He meant the cultivation of genuine felt experience, the deliberate, sustained practice of inhabiting a financial reality internally before it exists externally, not observing it from a distance, living inside it, with enough emotional and sensory specificity that the deeper mind begins processing it as data rather than imagination, not fantasy, architecture. What gets repeatedly experienced, internally or externally, gets incorporated into the operating model, gets treated as evidence of normal, gets used to recalibrate what the subconscious considers the appropriate financial baseline for someone like you. As that baseline shifts, the filter changes. The decisions flowing through it change. The risks that feel proportionate change. The opportunities that register as genuine possibilities, rather than things belonging to other people, change. The external world begins responding to a different internal signal. This is the foundation, the layer beneath which everything else either takes root or doesn't. Before we go further, go to the comments right now and write wealth mindset, not as a wish, as a declaration of the shift already beginning inside you. Hill believed that stating an intention outside your own mind, giving it form beyond private thought, begins the process of the subconscious treating it as a real direction. The people who write it are consistently the ones who follow through. Write wealth mindset in the comments. Then stay, because what comes next is where this moves from concept into something you can actually use. There's a practice most people attempt and almost nobody does correctly. Visualization. Not because the concept is flawed, because the way most people approach it removes the only element that makes it actually work. They picture the outcome, the house, the account balance, the life. They hold the image for a few minutes, feel a brief surge of something resembling desire, and return to the ordinary texture of their day, which promptly reasserts itself as the dominant reality and quietly absorbs whatever the exercise produced. Nothing shifts, and most people conclude that visualization doesn't work for them. What they've actually discovered is that observation doesn't work, because what they were doing wasn't inhabiting a new financial reality. It was watching one, from the outside, from the position of someone standing at a distance looking at a life they don't yet live. And observation, however sustained, never convinces the subconscious of anything. The subconscious doesn't update based on what you watch. It updates based on what you experience. Hill was precise about what the internal practice actually required. Not a picture held in the mind, a state inhabited in the body. The felt sense of financial security not as a future condition being observed, but as a present reality being lived, however briefly, however imperfectly, from the inside. What does financial security actually feel like as a daily baseline? Not the excitement of achieving it. The ordinary, unremarkable texture of it as a condition already present. The quality of a morning where financial pressure isn't the background noise of the day. The particular clarity available to a mind not organized around scarcity. The way decisions feel when they're made from sufficiency rather than from the chronic low-level weight of not enough. That felt state, not the image, not the number, not the external symbol, is what the subconscious can actually use. Because the subconscious doesn't speak the language of pictures. It speaks the language of feeling. And feeling generated internally with enough specificity and consistency is indistinguishable to the deeper mind from feeling generated by external circumstance. This is what Hill meant by faith, not blind optimism, but the cultivated capacity to generate genuine internal experience of a reality not yet physically present. To feel the truth of something before the evidence for it exists. Not as performance or self-deception, but as the deliberate use of the mind's own mechanism to introduce new data into the operating model. Think about the last time you felt genuine financial anxiety. Not a thought about money, the physical sensation of it. The way it narrowed attention, tightened something in the body, made the future feel smaller than it had seemed moments before. You didn't choose that feeling. It arose automatically, generated by a mind running its existing programming in response to a trigger. The feeling was completely real. The threat, in most cases, was a projection, which means the same mechanism generating that automatic feeling of scarcity can generate the feeling of sufficiency, of security, of being someone for whom financial expansion is simply the natural direction of travel, not automatically, deliberately, through the consistent, practiced, emotionally invested return to that state, until returning becomes easier, until the state becomes more familiar, until the subconscious begins incorporating it into its picture of what normal feels like for someone like you. That shift doesn't happen overnight, but it begins the moment the practice becomes genuine, the moment it stops being something performed for a few minutes each morning and becomes a real, felt, internal experience of a different financial identity. And the moment it becomes genuine, something in the external world begins to respond. Something most people notice before they can explain it. What people notice first isn't a financial result. It's a shift in perception, subtle enough that most dismiss it as coincidence, as a run of good luck, as things finally cooperating after a long stretch of resistance. They don't yet have a framework for what's actually happening, which is that the filter has begun to change. And when the filter changes, the world looks different. Not because the world has changed, because what was already present is now visible in a way it wasn't before. Hill documented this consistently across the lives he studied most carefully. The early signs of genuine financial transformation rarely announced themselves as financial results. They announced themselves as a changed relationship with possibility, a different quality of attention in ordinary moments, the sudden noticeability of things that had always been there, opportunities, connections, openings, that the previous filter had been screening out before they reached conscious awareness. Think about what it means for a filter to screen something out. It doesn't mean the thing wasn't there. It means the mind, operating from its existing model of what's relevant, decided before you had any conscious input that it didn't apply to someone like you. A door the filter considers irrelevant doesn't register as a door. It registers as wall. Then the filter shifts, and the same surface reveals an opening. Nothing in the external world changed. Everything in the internal one did. This is what Hill pointed toward when he described a mind reorganized around a new financial identity. It begins noticing and acting on a different quality of input. Not because the input changed, because the receiver did. Most people want to understand this as a metaphysical claim. It isn't. It's a description of how attention actually works. At any given moment, your mind is processing a volume of input far beyond what conscious awareness can hold. A filtering system, operating well below conscious thought, makes constant decisions about what's relevant enough to surface. And it doesn't make those decisions neutrally. It makes them based on the existing model, on the established picture of who you are and what category of outcome belongs to someone like you. Change the model, and the filtering decisions change with it. The conversation at a dinner party that would have passed through unregistered suddenly carries information that connects to something. The book mentioned offhandedly contains an idea that opens a direction. The person encountered by apparent accident turns out to be exactly the connection a specific next step required. None of this is mystical. All of it is the natural consequence of a mind whose filter has been recalibrated toward a different definition of relevant. Hill saw this without exception across the people who genuinely shifted their financial trajectories. The external results always followed an internal perceptual shift, and that shift always preceded the ability to explain, rationally and after the fact, why the results made sense. From the inside, it felt like things starting to work. From the outside, it was simply a filter doing what filters do, showing you exactly what you've trained it to look for. But here's where most people make a critical error at precisely this moment. Just as the filter begins changing, just as new possibilities start becoming visible, they do something that quietly dismantles everything that's been built. And they do it with the best possible intentions. The error is returning to the evidence. The moment things start shifting, the moment perception changes and new possibilities begin surfacing, most people instinctively turn to the external world and ask it to confirm what's happening internally. They look for proof, for results visible enough to justify continuing, for confirmation that the internal shift is real and the direction is right. And the external world, which operates on a delay, hasn't caught up yet. So the evidence isn't there, not in the form they're looking for, not with the clarity that would feel like genuine confirmation. And without that confirmation, the doubt that has been quietly present throughout suddenly carries more weight than the internal shift that preceded it. The new filter begins reverting. The perception narrows back toward what it was. The possibilities that had started becoming visible recede. And the person concludes, reasonably, based on available evidence, that what they experienced was temporary. A period of optimism that reality has now corrected. Hill identified this as one of the most consistently destructive patterns he observed, not among people who never tried, but among those who got far enough to feel the shift and then allowed the absence of immediate external confirmation to override it. He was precise about why. The subconscious, where the new financial identity is being constructed, operates on a different timeline than the conscious mind's need for validation. The internal shift is real, measurable in changed perception, changed attention, changed behavior. But the external results it produces accumulate gradually, through the decisions made differently, the opportunities noticed, the connections acted upon. That accumulation takes time. And the conscious mind, wanting confirmation now, experiences the gap between internal shift and external result as evidence that nothing is working. It isn't. It's evidence that transformation is working on the timeline it actually operates on, not the one the impatient, evidence-hungry conscious mind would prefer. Think about planting something. The decision to plant, the act of planting, and the appearance of first growth are three separate events divided by real time. During the interval between the second and third, nothing visible is occurring. Someone watching would see nothing. Someone who dug up the seed to check would find something in process, but the act of checking would end the process. The demand for immediate visible evidence is the equivalent of digging up the seed. Hill's principle of persistence pointed at something more specific than its conventional meaning. Not the grim continuation of someone who keeps going despite wanting to stop. The settled, informed confidence of someone who understands the timeline well enough that the absence of immediate results doesn't register as a reason to doubt the direction. Most people who fail at financial transformation don't fail at the beginning. They fail in the middle, in the gap between internal shift and external confirmation, in the quiet, unremarkable stretch where the new filter is operating, but the results haven't accumulated to a level visible enough to feel like proof. That stretch is where everything is decided. Not the beginning, when motivation is high. Not the end, when the results have arrived and the path makes obvious sense in retrospect. The middle, where continuing requires something that external validation was never going to supply. And here's what almost nobody realizes about that stretch. It's shorter than it feels from inside it. The middle stretch feels longer than it is for a specific reason. Not because the process is slow, because the mind, while the transition is underway, is running both versions of itself simultaneously. The old financial identity and the new one don't exchange positions cleanly. They coexist, the old one losing authority gradually, the new one gaining it gradually, with neither fully in control and both exerting real influence over how the world is being interpreted and what decisions are being made. That coexistence is uncomfortable in a way that's difficult to describe accurately. It doesn't feel like transformation in progress. It feels like instability. Like the ground beneath the financial sense of self is less solid than it was before the internal work began, which, in a specific sense, it is. The old certainty has been disturbed. The new one hasn't fully replaced it. And the mind, which strongly prefers solid ground, experiences the interval as a problem to be solved rather than a process to move through. The solution it reaches for most naturally is return. Go back to the familiar model. Restore the certainty that existed before the questioning began, even if that certainty was a ceiling. Certainty of any kind feels preferable, in the moment, to the disorientation of being between identities. Hill observed this pull toward regression with precision. He noted that people who successfully completed financial transformation almost always passed through a period that felt, from the inside, like the internal work was making things worse, where the old patterns had been sufficiently disrupted to lose their stabilizing function, but the new ones hadn't yet consolidated enough to replace them. He called this the period of testing, and he was unambiguous about what it required. Not reassessment, not a revised strategy, not a pause to evaluate whether the process was working. Continuation. Precisely, and only continuation. Because the testing period isn't evidence of failure. It's evidence of genuine transition. The old model threatened enough to mount its most serious defense, the new one close enough to consolidation that stopping now would mean abandoning the process at the exact moment it was nearest to completing itself. Think about learning something that requires rewiring a deeply established pattern. The most difficult moment isn't the beginning, when the gap between old and new is obvious and expected. It's the middle, when the old way no longer operates cleanly and the new way isn't yet automatic. When everything feels harder than it did before you started. That difficulty isn't a sign that the learning isn't working. It's the signature of learning at its most active. Financial identity transition works identically. The instability isn't the problem. It's the process, felt from the inside at the moment when the most significant internal restructuring is occurring. Most people don't know this. They encounter the instability and interpret it through the old model, which tells them, predictably, that this confirms what it always suspected, that the attempt to become someone different financially was ultimately beyond reach, that this groundlessness is the honest cost of having reached too far. The old model is always most persuasive at the moment it's most threatened, which means the most convincing arguments for returning to the familiar arrive at the exact moment when continuing matters most. Hill saw this without exception, and understanding it, not just intellectually, but at the level where it changes how you interpret what you're feeling in that moment, is the difference between the people who complete the transition and the people who turn back one step from the other side. But understanding alone isn't enough. Completing the transition requires something that insight cannot provide on its own. Something that has to be practiced until it becomes the automatic response to exactly this kind of pressure. What has to be practiced is the ability to observe the pressure without becoming it. not to suppress it, not to argue with it or override it through an act of will. To observe it, with the clear recognition that what you're experiencing is the old model doing what old models do when they're being replaced. That the pull toward the familiar is not information about your future. It's a reflex from your past. This sounds simple. It is not simple, because the pressure doesn't arrive labeled as the old model defending itself. It arrives labeled as truth, as the finally honest, clear-headed assessment of what's actually happening. It speaks in the language of realism, carries the weight of experience, and feels. This is the part that matters, exactly like your own voice, which is why observing it requires practice, not just understanding. Hill described this through the principle of self-discipline, but not in the conventional sense of forcing behavior through willpower. He was pointing at something more precise: the trained ability to create a gap between a feeling and a response, between the arising of an internal state and the action that state would automatically generate if left unexamined. That gap is where the new identity operates, and it has to be built deliberately in the ordinary moments before it becomes available in the high-stakes ones. Consider what happens in daily life when the old financial programming surfaces, not in dramatic moments, in small ones. The moment you see a price and feel immediate contraction. The moment an opportunity appears and something begins cataloging immediately why it won't work. The moment someone mentions money and the familiar automatic response arises before any conscious input. Those moments are not interruptions to the practice. They are the practice. Each one contains the same structure as the larger testing period, just at a smaller scale. A trigger, an automatic response from the existing model, and the opportunity, if the gap has been cultivated, to observe that response without being moved by it, to recognize it as old programming rather than present truth, and to choose, from that recognition, a response aligned with the new financial identity rather than the old one. Every time that choice is made, even in a minor moment, even in a moment that seems too small to matter, something is deposited into the new model. A small piece of evidence that the new identity is not just conceptually held, but actually operative, actually capable of generating behavior under real pressure. That evidence accumulates, and what it builds, quietly and without announcement, is the internal stability the testing period was designed to dismantle. Hill called this organized thought, the disciplined capacity to direct mental activity with intention rather than allowing it to be directed by whatever stimulus is present. Not a natural state, an acquired one, built through practice in ordinary moments specifically so it's available in extraordinary ones. Most people wait for the extraordinary moment to access this capacity for the first time. They encounter the testing period and attempt, under its full pressure, to suddenly observe their own mental states clearly and choose deliberately. It doesn't work that way. The high-stakes moment requires what the low-stakes practice built, which is why the daily, unremarkable encounters with the old financial programming are not distractions from the work. They are the work. And what becomes available when that work has been done consistently enough isn't just a better response to financial pressure. It's an entirely different experience of what financial possibility looks like. What financial possibility looks like changes when the internal work has accumulated enough weight to shift the baseline. Not dramatically, not in a single moment that announces itself. In the quiet, almost imperceptible way a landscape changes when the season turns, gradually, then undeniably, then so completely that the previous version becomes difficult to fully recall. The first thing that changes is what feels possible. Not what you believe is possible in the abstract, the intellectual acceptance of a principle. What the body registers as within reach when an opportunity appears. What the gut-level response to financial expansion becomes when the old model has lost enough authority to stop generating automatic contraction every time something real comes into view. This is the shift Hill pointed at when he described wealth consciousness as a state rather than a strategy, not a set of behaviors to adopt, A fundamental change in the internal environment from which all financial behavior naturally emerges. The way different weather produces different growth from the same soil, without the soil having to do anything deliberate. You don't force the new behavior. It arises from the new baseline. Consider what changes downstream when the baseline shifts. The conversation you would have avoided before, the one requiring you to present yourself at a level you weren't sure you'd earned, becomes available. Not because you've decided to be more confident, because the internal reference point has moved and the conversation now falls within the range of what feels natural rather than what feels like a reach. The opportunity you would have missed entirely, not because it wasn't visible, but because the old filter had classified it as belonging to a different category of person, registers. Gets held long enough to be examined. Gets acted upon rather than filed under things that work for other people. None of these changes announce themselves as transformation. From the inside, they feel like ordinary decisions made slightly differently. Ordinary moments inhabited slightly more fully. Ordinary days producing a slightly different quality of outcome through a slightly different quality of engagement. The accumulation of slightly different is what a changed financial life is actually made of. Hill understood this with a clarity that his most quoted principles sometimes obscure. The dramatic formulations, the definite chief aim, the burning desire, were pointing at internal states, not external strategies. The power wasn't in the concepts. It was in what happened to a person's baseline reality when those states were genuinely inhabited rather than intellectually adopted. Genuine inhabitation is always the result of the same process. The internal practice sustained past the point where it feels like it's working. The daily encounters with old programming met with the gap between stimulus and response. The consistent return to the felt experience of the new financial identity, even when, especially when, the external world hasn't caught up yet. That process doesn't produce results on the schedule the conscious mind finds satisfying. It produces them on the schedule that internal transformation actually operates on, which is slower than most people want and faster than most people believe when they're inside the middle stretch. But here's what almost nobody tells you about the point where the accumulation becomes undeniable. It doesn't feel like achievement. It feels like recognition. Like something that was always true has finally been allowed to surface. And that feeling, quiet, unannounced, more like coming home than arriving somewhere new, is the signal that the reason you weren't rich yet has finally been addressed at the level where it actually lived. There is one final layer. One more thing that determines whether this becomes a permanent shift or another insight that eventually fades back into the background. The final layer is the one most people skip entirely. Not because they don't understand its importance, because it requires something that feels like it should already be in place, something most people assume they have, and discover, when they look honestly, they've been substituting something else for without realizing. It's the decision to include yourself in the category of people for whom this works. Not as an affirmation, not as a belief consciously adopted, as a settled, interior, non-negotiable position, held not because the evidence currently supports it, but because you've decided, below the level of conscious thought, that your financial life is worth the sustained commitment required to change it at the level where it actually needs to change. Most people encounter the principles in this conversation and experience them as genuinely true, for people in general. They find the mechanism credible, the evidence persuasive, the logic sound. And then, in a move so subtle it rarely gets noticed, they position themselves as observers of these principles rather than subjects of them. They understand why this works. They don't quite believe it works for them specifically. For someone with their particular history, their particular sequence of previous attempts and previous disappointments, their particular version of the gap between where they are and where they want to be. Hill identified this as the most fundamental financial obstacle of all. Not the limiting belief about money, the limiting belief about the self encountering money. The quiet, persistent, rarely examined conviction that transformation of this depth is available, but perhaps not quite to someone with your specific story. That conviction doesn't present itself as a limitation. It presents itself as honesty, as the grounded, mature recognition of where you currently are. But it isn't honesty. It's the final defense of the old model, dressed in the most respectable language it owns. Because genuine honesty acknowledges where you are without deciding that where you are determines where you're going. What the old model produces in this final form is something different, the conversion of a starting point into a destination. The use of current position as evidence of permanent limitation. And as long as that conversion operates, however subtly, however unconsciously, every principle, every practice, every internal shift will find its ceiling in the belief that it applies to others more completely than it applies to you. Hill observed this with painful consistency among people who understood his work most deeply and changed their financial lives least. The understanding was genuine. The application was always slightly withheld, slightly qualified, slightly tentative, slightly organized around the unspoken question of whether someone like me really gets to have this. The answer to that question cannot come from the outside. No evidence can confirm it before it's decided. No accumulation of insight can produce it. It has to be decided first, not because the decision is final and permanent and requires no maintenance, because it has to precede the evidence rather than follow it. The interior position that you are someone for whom genuine financial transformation is not an exception, made before the external world has done anything to confirm it, held through the testing period and the pressure of the old model, until the evidence finally begins organizing itself around a self that was already committed to receiving it. This is what Hill meant, at the deepest level, by burning desire. Not the wanting of wealth. The decided, committed orientation toward it, from a self that has already included itself in the category of people for whom it's available. Not eventually. Not once the proof arrives. Now, before the confirmation. Before anything external has changed. In the quiet, private, unwitnessed moment of deciding that your financial life is not an exception to what's possible. It is simply the next thing that's going to change. The reason you're not rich yet isn't a mystery. It never was. It's the distance between the financial life your conscious mind has been reaching for and the financial identity your deeper mind has accepted as appropriate for someone like you. That distance, invisible, never felt as a distance, experienced simply as the way things are, has been the most expensive thing you carry. Not because it represents failure, because it represents an instruction set running on hardware that was never consulted about whether it wanted those instructions. You didn't choose the financial model you inherited. You didn't select the atmosphere that shaped your earliest relationship with money. You didn't decide, at an age when deciding was impossible, that scarcity was your natural condition or that wealth belonged to a category of person you weren't quite. Those things happened to you. And then, this is the part worth sitting with, you continued them. Not deliberately, not consciously, through the automatic, daily execution of a program that felt like reality because it had been running long enough to become indistinguishable from it. The continuation wasn't a character flaw. It was the natural behavior of a mind doing what minds do, operating from the model it was given, producing the results the model was designed to produce, mistaking the consistency of those results for evidence that the model was accurate. It was never accurate. It was familiar. And familiar has always been the most convincing impersonator of truth available to the human mind. Hill spent 20 years inside this understanding, documenting it across lives that began in genuine limitation and arrived at genuine financial freedom. And what he found, without exception, was that the crossing was never primarily a financial event. It was an identity event. The money followed the person. The external life rearranged itself, gradually and without ceremony, around the internal life that had been rebuilt from the inside out. Not the other way around. That sequence is available to you. It has always been available to you. The only thing standing between you and it is the model, inherited, unrequested, never fully examined, running in the background of every financial decision you've ever made. And models can be changed. Not quickly, not without the testing period and the instability and the moment where the old one makes its most persuasive case for return, but changed completely and permanently until the new one operates with the same automatic authority the old one once had, until the new baseline is the one being protected, until a different financial identity stops being something you're working to maintain and becomes simply who you are. That is what this entire conversation has been moving toward. Not the information, the permission, the specific, interior permission to be someone for whom the financial life you've been imagining is not a fantasy belonging to a different category of person, but a direction. The natural next expression of an identity that has decided, quietly and without waiting for external confirmation, that it is no longer available to be defined by a model it never chose. Hill couldn't make that decision for the people he studied. He could document the mechanism, illuminate what became possible when the internal work was done with genuine commitment. But the decision itself, the unwitnessed, interior choice to treat your own financial potential as something worth the full depth of what this requires, was always theirs, as it is yours. Not someday. Not when the doubt has cleared or the conditions feel more favorable or the version of yourself that deserves this finally materializes. Now, with exactly the history you have, exactly the starting point you're at, exactly the distance between where you are and where you're going. The reason you're not rich yet has been named. What happens next is the only question that has ever actually mattered. If something in this video reached a place that needed to be reached, don't let it stop here. Share it with 5 people who need to hear this. And follow this channel, because what comes next goes even deeper. The work continues. And so do you.